This ground that I'm walking on right now, it used to be covered by water. And as lake levels are expected to continue to drop here at Lake Mead, the gap between where the water was and where it is.
There's a line on the canyon wall that should not exist. It runs for miles, pale as bone, pressed into red sandstone like a scar that never healed. It sits 175 feet above the surface of the water. The rangers who work here call it the bathtub ring. Scientists call it a mineral deposit, calcium carbonate left behind as the waterline retreated year after year, foot by foot. But if you stand at the rim of the canyon and look down at what the water has uncovered, neither of those descriptions quite fits what you are seeing. What you are seeing is a reckoning, and it has been 102 years in the making. New footage from Lake Mead, America's largest reservoir, has been circulating among engineers, water managers, and federal officials since late 2024. The images are not what anyone expected, even among people who have been watching the decline for years. Boat hulls cracked open by desert heat. Concrete intake structures standing exposed in full daylight for the first time in half a century. Rusted metal drums rising from lakebed mud that did not exist as dry land 18 months ago. And the bathtub ring, still climbing higher with each passing season, measuring not just how much water is left, but how much is gone and will not return. This is the story of how the American Southwest built a civilization on a river that was never big enough to support it, and why the footage coming out of Lake Mead is not just dramatic video. It is a warning system that is finally switched on. To understand what is happening at Lake Mead, you have to understand what Lake Mead was designed to do. The Hoover Dam was completed in 1936, during the darkest years of the Great Depression. It was at that moment the largest dam ever constructed on Earth. Engineers from around the world came to Nevada just to see it. The concrete alone weighed more than a small mountain. The reservoir that formed behind it, named after Elwood Mead, the Bureau of Reclamation commissioner who oversaw its planning, was nothing short of an engineering miracle. When Lake Mead filled to capacity in 1983, it held 26.12 million acre-feet of water. That is enough to submerge the entire state of Pennsylvania under a foot of water and still have billions of gallons remaining. That water did not just sit there. It worked. It powered Hoover Dam's turbines, which generated electricity for Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. It flowed through canals and aqueducts to farms across Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada. It made the Imperial Valley, a stretch of California desert where summer temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, into one of the most productive agricultural regions in North America. It allowed Las Vegas to grow from a small railroad town into a metropolitan area of 2.8 million people. It allowed Phoenix to become the fifth largest city in the United States. For decades, the system worked. Wet years refilled what dry years drew down. The canyon walls stayed submerged. Whatever was dropped into the deep water, boats, machinery, other things stayed there. Then the lake began to fall. The story of Lake Mead's decline does not begin in 2000, when hydrologists first started tracking a troubling pattern of reduced snowpack in the Rocky Mountains. It does not begin in 2021, when the Bureau of Reclamation declared the first ever official shortage on the Colorado River. It begins on November 24, 1922, in a room at Bishop's Lodge in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was the day the Colorado River Compact was signed. The compact was negotiated by representatives from 7 states: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, California, Arizona, and Nevada, under the chairmanship of Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce. The political problem they were trying to solve was urgent. California had already begun diverting massive quantities of Colorado River water to irrigate the Imperial Valley. Arizona's governor had threatened to deploy the state militia to stop the diversions by force. The federal government stepped in before things escalated further, and the compact was the result. The deal divided the river into 2 basins: the upper basin, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and the lower basin, California, Arizona, Nevada. Each basin received an allocation of 7.5 million acre-feet per year, with additional water set aside for Mexico and future growth. The total came to roughly 17.5 million acre-feet annually, a number derived from flow measurements taken between 1899 and 1921. Here is the problem with that number. The years from 1899 to 1921 were not representative of the Colorado River's long-term behavior. They were anomalous, unusually wet by the standards of the past millennium. Researchers at the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree-ring Research, working with ancient bristlecone pines whose growth rings serve as a precise record of wet and dry years going back to roughly 800 AD, have since determined that the long-term average flow of the Colorado River is closer to 13 million acre-feet per year, not 17.5 million. The engineers in Santa Fe in 1922 built the legal foundation of the American Southwest on water that the river, on average over 12 centuries, did not actually carry. Some of those engineers knew it at the time. Historical records from the negotiations show that concerns were raised about the brevity of the measurement period. Those concerns were set aside. The states wanted water. The federal government wanted peace. Herbert Hoover wanted a signed document. The compact was sealed, and a 25% overallocation was baked into the system before a single shovel of concrete had been poured for Hoover Dam. For 70 years, Lake Mead absorbed the difference. The buffer worked until it didn't. The retreat of Lake Mead did not announce itself. It crept in quietly, one dry year following another, each one pulling the waterline down a little further and leaving the bathtub ring climbing a little higher on the canyon walls. The years between 2000 and 2021 are now described by hydrologists using a word that carries more weight than it initially appears to: aridification. Not drought. Drought is a temporary condition. Drought ends. Snowpack recovers. Reservoirs refill. Aridification is something different. It describes a permanent shift in baseline conditions, a new normal that does not reverse because it is not a deviation from the norm. It is the norm reasserting itself. The wet decades of the 20th century, when the Colorado River ran high and the compact seemed generous rather than reckless, were the anomaly. The drier conditions emerging in the 21st century are, according to the paleoclimate record, far more consistent with the river's long-term behavior. The Southwest is not returning to drought. It is returning to itself. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By 2010, Lake Mead had dropped below 1,100 feet of surface elevation, a level not seen since the reservoir was first filling in the 1930s. By 2015, it fell below 1,080 feet. In 2021, when the Bureau of Reclamation declared its first Tier 1 shortage, mandatory cuts to Arizona and Nevada's allocations were triggered automatically. In 2022, the shortage escalated to Tier 2A. The lake kept falling. By mid-2024, the surface had dropped to levels that exposed things no living person had seen since they were submerged. Boats that sank in 1980s and 1990s now sat on cracked mud, their hulls split open by cycles of desert heat and cold. Concrete infrastructure that had been underwater for half a century was naked in the sunlight, and objects that certain people, in certain decades, had believed would remain hidden forever began to surface. In May 2022, boaters at Hemingway Harbor spotted something embedded in the newly exposed lake bed. A metal drum, corroded, partially open. They flagged down a National Park Service ranger. Within hours, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department had forensic teams working a section of shoreline that had been under 60 feet of water just 2 years earlier. What was inside the drum dated to the late 1970s or early 1980s. The remains showed evidence of a gunshot wound. The drum itself was consistent with disposal methods associated with organized crime, methods that Las Vegas, in an earlier chapter of its history, had some familiarity with. The case remains open. A second set of remains in a second barrel surfaced 6 days later. More followed after that. Bones scattered by decades of underwater currents. Personal effects. Objects that had gone into deep water under the assumption that deep water was permanent. The bodies are, in a grim and unintentional way, a precise metaphor for the larger crisis the lake is revealing. For decades, the problems of the Colorado River system, the gap between allocated and actual water, the legal fictions written into the compact, the promises made to states and cities, and farming operations that the river could not physically keep, were submerged beneath Lake Mead's surface. The water covered them. The system kept running. Now the water is receding, and everything that was hidden is coming into the light. The barrels are not the worst thing the lake will surface in the years ahead, but they're the most visible signal that the lake's role as a depository for inconvenient truths is coming to an end. There are two elevations built into the engineering specifications of Hoover Dam that determine what happens next. Federal water managers know them. City planners in Phoenix and Las Vegas know them. And increasingly, they're the numbers that define the outer limit of what the American Southwest can absorb. The first is 950 feet. At 950 feet of surface elevation, Hoover Dam's hydroelectric turbines begin to lose efficiency. Water pressure drops. A phenomenon called cavitation, the formation of destructive air bubbles inside the machinery, becomes a serious risk. Below that threshold, the dam's ability to generate power degrades quickly. Hoover Dam currently provides electricity to approximately 1.3 million residents across Nevada, Arizona, and California. It generates roughly 4 billion kilowatt hours annually. Replacing that capacity from alternative sources would be a significant challenge, but it is manageable. The second number is harder to absorb. At 895 feet, what the Bureau of Reclamation officially designates as dead pool, Lake Mead falls below the level of the dam's lowest outlet works. Water can no longer exit the reservoir by gravity. Hoover Dam stops functioning entirely. No power generation, no water releases, no deliveries downstream to the communities and agricultural systems that depend on those releases to exist. The Colorado River would still flow into Lake Mead. It simply would not flow out. As of early 2025, Lake Mead's surface sits approximately 50 to 60 feet above dead pool. In a year of poor snowpack and high temperatures, conditions that are becoming more common, not less, the lake can drop by 20 feet or more. The margin that sounds comfortable when you do the math is not comfortable at all. Las Vegas understood the trajectory earlier than any other major city on the system. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, which manages the region's water supply, recognized in the early 2000s that the existing intake infrastructure for Las Vegas was designed for a full reservoir. As the lake dropped, those intakes, sitting at elevations calibrated to a high water line, would eventually be exposed above the surface. In a dead pool scenario, Las Vegas would not run dry because the lake was empty. It would run dry because the city could no longer physically reach the water that remained. The authorities' response was a project locals call the Third Straw, a new intake tunnel drilled through underwater rock to an access point deep enough to function even if the lake dropped below dead pool. The project took 7 years to complete, required engineers to work in pressurized chambers 300 feet below the lake's surface, and cost approximately $1.5 billion. It was finished in 2015. Its intake sits at roughly 860 feet below the dead pool threshold. Even if Hoover Dam stops releasing water, Las Vegas can still drink. That $1.5 billion investment was not a bet that the crisis would happen. It was an acknowledgement by the people closest to the data that it could, and it reveals something important. The cities that have studied this problem most closely are not waiting for federal reassurances. They are building around the possibility of catastrophic failure. Phoenix does not have a third straw to build. Arizona draws approximately 40% of its water from the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal that carries Colorado River water from Lake Havasu, downstream of Hoover Dam, across the desert to Phoenix, Tucson, and the surrounding region. The CAP cost over $4 billion to construct, over $10 billion in today's money, and it is one of the most expensive water infrastructure projects in American history. Arizona also holds junior water rights on the Colorado. It was the last lower basin state to ratify the 1922 compact And in exchange for federal funding to build the CAP, it accepted a lower priority position in shortage calculations. Junior priority means Arizona gets cut first, deepest, and earliest when the river runs short. The 2021 Tier 1 shortage cut Arizona's allocation by 512,000 acre-feet. The 2022 escalation cut deeper. Phoenix has responded by drilling more groundwater wells, expanding water recycling programs, and paying agricultural producers to reduce consumption. None of it replaces the structural vulnerability. When the lake drops, Arizona is the first to feel it. And the lake keeps dropping. There is one major player in the Colorado River system that has not faced mandatory cuts despite 2 decades of crisis-level decline, and understanding why explains the most fundamental tension in the politics of Western water. The Imperial Valley of California holds senior water rights on the Colorado River, claims that predate the compact itself, established when the valley began irrigating its desert farmland through the Imperial Canal in the early 1900s. Under Western water law, seniority determines who gets water in a shortage. The Imperial Irrigation District's rights rank above those of Las Vegas, above Phoenix, above most of the lower basin cities that have spent billions retrofitting their water infrastructure for a drier future. The Imperial Valley uses that water to grow approximately 70% of the United States' winter vegetables, lettuce, broccoli, carrots, melons, on roughly 500,000 acres of land that would otherwise be uninhabitable desert. The valley's agriculture feeds tens of millions of Americans. It also uses enormous quantities of water to grow alfalfa hay, a significant portion of which is exported to Saudi Arabia, China, and other countries that have chosen not to deplete their own groundwater aquifers to feed livestock. Water that flows from the Colorado River, the same river that is slowly strangling Las Vegas and cutting Phoenix's supply year by year, ends up as hay on cargo ships bound for Riyadh. Approximately 80% of all Colorado River water goes to agricultural use. The cities that have invested billions in conservation infrastructure, that have mandated drought restrictions, that have paid residents to remove lawns and replace them with gravel, those cities consume the remaining 20%. And when shortages are calculated, the cities are cut first. This is not a secret. It is written into the law, and changing it would require confronting some of the most entrenched property rights in the American legal tradition. The water managers who work inside the federal system, the analysts at the Bureau of Reclamation, the engineers of the Army Corps, the hydrologists at the U.S. Geological Survey, understand the situation with a clarity that does not always make it into press releases or political speeches. Their technical documents use language that is precise and unsparing. Aridification is a structural shift, not a weather event. Lake Mead may never recover. The compact allocates water that the river, on its long-term average, does not carry. There are exactly 2 ways the Colorado River crisis resolves. The first is through deliberate restructuring. That would mean reopening the Colorado River Compact, a document that has not been renegotiated in its 102-year history, and replacing its allocations with ones that reflect the river's actual long-term capacity. It would mean reducing agricultural allocations significantly, which would require confronting the seniority system and the property rights attached to it. It would mean acknowledging openly at the federal and state level that some of the growth that occurred in the 20th century Southwest was built on water that never reliably existed. It would require difficult political decisions to be made by elected officials who answer to constituents who depend on those water allocations. The second path is crisis. Crisis resolution means Lake Mead falls to dead pool. It means Hoover Dam goes silent. It means Phoenix wakes up one morning to news that its CAP canal has stopped flowing. It means federal emergency declarations, competition between states for remaining groundwater, agricultural collapse in the Imperial Valley as even senior water rights become meaningless when there is no water to allocate. It means 40 million people discovering, in real time, that the infrastructure they depended on was designed for a river that no longer exists in the form it took during the wet decades of the previous century. The federal government has spent billions in recent years on voluntary conservation agreements, paying farmers to fallow fields, subsidizing cities to install efficient fixtures, funding water banking programs across the basin. Those investments have slowed the decline at the margins. They have not addressed the structural problem, which is that the law promises 17.5 million acre-feet to a river that provides, on average, 13 million. The bathtub ring at Lake Mead is not a stain. It is a record.